In JavaScript, to make AJAX calls, we use the fetch keyword. Using fetch, we can make network calls to any remote service or a web API. Using fetch, we will be sending a request and the remote server will be returning us a response. A fetch call is an asynchronous call. Asynchronous means the language would not wait for that code to complete. Rather, it will continue executing the code present after it, and hence it would not block. And also will inform once we get a response from the server, then how to use it or how to handle that. So here in fetch, I have passed in an URL. So basically, we are making a call to the website JSON placeholder where some sample JSON data is available, and we are calling it basically an AJAX call, and it will return us the sample data. So here we have made a fetch call to this URL. So basically, whenever we make a fetch call, we would be returned with a promise. A promise means that currently we do not have an answer, but there is a promise that after some time, either that answer would be received or a notification that the call was unsuccessful or an error crept in. Promise is since resolved after some time, the code or the language would not block there, and also we can apply some functions over promise like .then, using which we can inform that once this promise is resolved, then what do we do. So here I've made an arrow function in then whose input will be automatically set once the promise is resolved. So whatever the result of that would be passed in data, and we convert that data into JSON. Now because this is also taking some time, the call for converting into JSON is also an asynchronous call. Now because for the first then statement, the return value, that is data.json, is also an asynchronous call, we can apply a .then function over it as well, because it's also returning us a promise. And for this .then, we pass in as input whatever the output was of the previous then statement. So for previous then statement, we are expecting a JSON, and now we are passing the same JSON into the second then statement, and for that we are outputting console.log JSON. So we are just printing that JSON. So we can now see that the JSON is printed. So here we have sent a request to JSON placeholder by using fetch. After some time we got its response, then we converted that into JSON, and then the output of that we printed it. To handle asynchronous calls, we can also use async and await features introduced in ECMAScript 7 rather than using the .then keyword. So here let's make an arrow function whose name is mock request, and in this arrow function let's make the fetch call to the same URL, and once the output is received, we save that in the data variable, and on data we call .json, and the output of that we are printing it. But when we call this function mock request, there is nothing in the output console, or the output is undefined or null. This is because when we made the fetch call is an asynchronous call and it takes some time to get completed. But in the meanwhile, JavaScript returned a promise from the fetch call. So actually in data, a promise is stored, not the response from the server. Now because in data there is a promise, when we convert it into JSON, it is not necessary that we get a valid result. And that is why when we console.log the JSON data, there is no valid output. But so whenever we make an asynchronous call in a function and wait for it, then we have to mark that function as asynchronous as well. So here let's write mock request equals async function. And in this function, for the fetch call, we are waiting as well. So before that we write await. Now here it will wait for the fetch call to be completed. And once the fetch call is completed, whatever response we get from the server is saved in data. Now we apply .json on that function, but it also takes some time to complete, and also it's an asynchronous call. So we write await before it as well. And once we get the actual answer of it, we save it in JSON data. So we can see that the correct output is printed in the console. Similar to JSON placeholder, we can see examples for calling an actual APIs. So I have used the geocode API of Google Maps API, and in address, that is the URL parameter, I have passed coding plus elements as its value. And we can see that with this call, the proper output is printed. That is the complete address of coding elements, its zip code and its latitude and longitude, etc. have been printed.